Hello. Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Hendel. This is Ruth Hendel, and we are honored to have helped launch the Hendel Center for Ethics and Social Justice. And we welcome you tonight to this evening of theater talkback with the creative team and cast of the Catastrophist. We're delighted that JTS has created the center and has made the teaching of Jewish ethics and social justice a core part of its curriculum, both for the students and future lay leaders who are studying at the seminary, but also who, using the center to continue a dialogue and an education with graduates and rabbis out in the field. Ruth and I have spent a lot of the last 20 years being involved in theater, and we're particularly pleased that the center has gotten involved and has put its time and effort and people in support of tonight's evening, and has worked with everybody in the Catastrophist, and we're going to have a very, very wonderful evening. And so it's our pleasure to introduce the executive director of the center and associate dean of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Rabbi Stephanie Ruske. So go ahead, Stephanie.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody. Really nice to be together. I have the great honor of getting to introduce Kendall Pinckney. So pay attention, because he is going to be a rabbi in a year, and he is going to be a theater-making rabbi. And I think we're just starting to hear the beginning of the new kind of way of being a rabbi that he is creating. We are working together at the intersection of arts and justice. And this is our first sort of collaboration of theater, arts, and justice in this era. And we are soon going to be launching a residency for artists. So Jews of color, Indigenous, Sephardi, Mizrahi. And this is sort of a precursor to it. These people will be in residence, learning at JTS, doing their art and theater at JTS, and hopefully not only will they be transformed by being at JTS, but we will be transformed by having them there. So this is the first public creation of this kind of theater conversation together, but there will be many others. So Kendall is going to lead us tonight, and I get to just introduce you. So thank you, and thank you for everyone for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi Ruske, for that introduction. Thank you, Steve and Ruth, for your words as well. It is beyond delightful to be here with everyone this evening. Who would have thought that as I entered JTS 4 years ago, that here we would be, close to my last year, and we're actually doing a theater talkback. We've done some theater talkbacks before, but we're expanding into even a few more wonderful things as well. So I'm really happy about this. Just to set out kind of what we will be doing this evening, we're going to have a brief talkback, and by brief, I mean, it'll be an hour, maybe a little bit more, but it always feels brief because the things that the panelists will say will inspire more questions. We will want it to go longer, I am sure. That being said, it's really wonderful to be here with you all. I will just also instruct you all that as far as Q&A is concerned, there's no need to look for a Q&A question and answer box down below. All questions can come through the chat. I will have someone, Rabbi Ruske will thankfully be helping me manage the questions. And I know that we're going to have quite a few questions for this wonderfully assembled cast and creative team and science team that is gathered here today. So with that being said, we will dive right into it. I'm going to introduce all of our guests this evening. I'm going to read their short bios. If you want to read their longer bios, you can go back to the registration page where you registered for this event, and you can see just how impressive they are. So But starting first with the playwright, Lauren Gunderson. So Lauren Gunderson is one of America's most produced playwrights, often theatricalizing and foregrounding important stories relating to science, technology, feminism, and so much more. She is a two-time winner of the Steinberg ATCA New Play Award for I and You, and the Book of Will, and the winner of the Lanford Wilson Award and the Otis Guernsey New Voices Award. Sitting right next to Lauren is Dr. Nathan Wolf, a world-renowned virologist and entrepreneur. Until 2008, he was a full professor in epidemiology at UCLA, after which he founded Metabiota, a data analytics company focused on epidemic risk. He was chosen to be on Time's 2011 Most Influential Persons list, and his work has been published or covered in Nature, Science, and the New York Times, to name a few. So glad to have you all with us. And now, bringing in the actor, William Demerit. William Demerit, my good friend, is an actor, writer, dialect coach, theatrical and voiceover director, theater educator, and an award-winning audiobook narrator who just has one of the most beautiful voices. My goodness, he is a proud graduate of Yale Drama. He can be seen in HBO's Emmy-winning film, The Normal Heart, HBO Max's The Flight Attendant, and will be featured in this winter's Netflix's The Noel Diary. So be on the lookout for that. And finally, we have Jason Menadakis, who will be joining us. Jason is in his 15th season as the artistic director of Marin Theater Company, or Marin, there we go, I'm East Coast, it's Marin Theater Company. Previously, he served as the artistic director of Actors Express in Atlanta and Cincinnati Shakespeare Festival in Ohio. He has directed a veritable host of plays, both at Marin Theater Company and in regional theater houses across the country. Everyone, welcome, 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 Baruchim Habayim. It is so wonderful to be with you all. And part of what's making me so excited about having this conversation is there's this notion that comes from Jewish text, particularly from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, where in essence it says, who is wise? The person who learns from any and everyone. And I have the feeling that we're going to learn so much from you all and the various professions and expertise that you all have, and it will really illuminate and inspire how it is we think about our Jewishness, and even more importantly, how we think about our humanity. So with that being said, welcome, and I will just start off with some questions. So Lauren, we can assume that a fair amount of the people who have gathered here this evening have already seen The Catastrophist, but just in case someone was inspired to hop on to this talkback last moment and will watch the play after, can you give us a brief description of it so that we can ground ourselves for this discussion?
Absolutely. It is also the hardest question to ask a playwright to answer succinctly. What is your play about? One would assume it would be a simple answer, but it is always like, oh, it's about all the things, which is certainly true in this very personal, intimate yet epic story. So The Catastrophist is, I will just set the stage when you start watching. It is a very close-up on a human's eyes who open, and the play begins kind of with an intake of air. And we are with this person as they try to figure out where they are, why they're there, what they're meant to be doing, and how to negotiate this seemingly blank theatrical space. What we come to know is this person is a scientist, specialist in biology, even more of a specialist in viruses. And there is an interplay with this person that we're watching and the writer of The Thing, which he calls his wife, is a playwright. He lets us know in the very early part. So the play really becomes, in some ways, a conversation with a scientist, in some place, a conversation with a son, some with a father, some with a husband, some with a character against its author, a character in a play. And we talk about a lot of things, but it is based on this incredible human's life, although it is fictionalized and dramatized, as I am wont to do, but it is based on the life and work of Nathan Wolf.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us that little bit of grounding to bring us in. So we're going to have a lot of time to talk about the process, the themes, and even since this is the Kendall Center for Justice and Ethics that is doing this work, we're even going to zoom out and talk about some of these broader themes around justice and ethics as we go through. So I think that everyone will kind of find their way in to something during our conversation. So, all right, this was a play that is not specifically about the pandemic. Lauren, we talked about that a touch. It was but it was written, directed, performed, and filmed during the course of the pandemic, which, I mean, that's just a lot. I mean, this has been like quite the 15, 16 months, and that's an understatement. But what I'd love to hear is, can you all detail what it was like to create this piece in such an abbreviated amount of time and under such circumstances? I know that you all were not literally in the same space, but rather, Lauren, you were at home, you were writing, among other things, and Jason and Bill, you all were in person. So actually, Jason and Bill, could you all start and let us, give us a sense of what it was like to create this piece from the ground up?
Well, I'm going to actually, Lauren, why don't you talk about sort of the writing of it, because that's sort of where the whole thing started. We had a brief conversation where I actually asked Lauren, but when the pandemic hit and we realized we were going to end up having to cancel productions, we didn't quite know what we were going to do. I asked Lauren if she was interested in writing something that could kind of live between theater and something that could live virtually. And I said, why don't you think about adapting Nathan's book? And she immediately said,
no. Why would a wife ever write about their partner? Heck no. And then, of course, a good idea sticks around and bugs you until you agree. Yes, so the idea came about with, well, here we are in a pandemic. You happen to be married to an expert in this very subject. What if his story might be worth telling, might be worth dramatizing? Is there something there? And so I hesitated for a while until figuring out, those of you who've seen it and those of you who will, this won't be a spoiler, but the line that occurred to me that made me text Jason back and said, okay, I'm writing it, damn it, was imagining a character that said, my wife would like you to know, on and on. And this is a refrain in the play. And it just made me think, what does that mean? What is a character? What would that mean for the play, for the character? And then to think, my wife is a writer, I think she's writing this. What does that mean? What world are we in? How exciting, and yet how simple. And that is the kind of thread that I tried to follow to figure out how to tell this very complex. I mean, every human is complex. And I like to start discussions of this particular play saying, any of you, any human on earth could have a beautiful one-person play, several one-person plays written about them, depending on what part of their life you focus on, what trauma or tragedy or triumph you hone in on. I happen to know this person very well. And so it felt like something I could find the corners of to make it human and personal. But that was all the writing of it. And I think I told Jason I was going to adapt his book and then did not. And then just like, I'm just gonna tell some of Nathan's book, a lot of his science, a lot of what happened after the book was written. The book is called The Viral Storm. Great title. And so it became much more personal. It's the stuff that's frankly not very much in his book and not very much well documented in magazine articles in The Wired and National Geographic and on and on and on. It's the personal stuff. And that's what's the meat of every great play, is how close you can get to this person's point of view, to their heartbeat, to their what catches their breath and what makes them pause and journey. And so that was the building of this play, was how can we accomplish all of that with a big vision, with an epic kind of emotional landscape, but such an intimate, it's one person, one stage, and like nothing else. How big can we get with such small, simple stuff? And this is where Jason and Bill come in.
Yeah, and it was a little bit of a strange process because Lauren had to write so much alone, and that's normally at least with our process, it's not something that happens that much, because Lauren's been in residence with our company in Marin for I guess we're in year 6 now. And then, she had been in San Francisco, and we'd been working with her for even longer than that. And she and I have known each other since the Atlanta days. So it stretches back even further. And in this process, Lauren was writing on her own and was getting feedback, and was, it was all digital. It was very strange. And there was a lot of conversation that was happening with Nathan. And then almost immediately, there was a script that Bill read. It was the first complete draft, I think. Bill actually did the reading of it for us. It was the first time Nathan got to hear it, and any part of it. If you can imagine, like, he didn't get to test out scenes. He literally had the whole thing dumped on him by us, all at one time. And, that was between, I think Lauren and I had the conversation in late April, early May. She started writing at that point. And then I'm pretty sure the first reading happened in late September, early October. And then we were filming by the week before Thanksgiving. So this all happened, between May and November. It was the most compressed time. And the reason that I had actually asked Lauren, it's interesting that we're having this conversation with an institute that is so interested in morality and ethics, because that was a big part of why I went to Lauren in the first place. Because one of the things that Nathan's book does he does such an amazing job of is talk about how pandemics now and in the future are going to be the result of moral choices that we've made as the first world, in terms of how we influence and the things that we make difficult in the third world. And when we first started hearing about the pandemic in March and in April, and we started hearing that it was coming from China and it was coming out of a lab, and then we were hearing, no, it was coming out of a wet market. The first time I heard it came out of a wet market, that's the connection that I made immediately to Nathan's book, because Nathan goes into quite a bit of detail about how that happens. And so that's where this crazy national dialogue that was happening, there was between, was it from a lab intentionally being made to harm us on purpose, or is this the result of a lot of choices that have happened between the first world, developing nations, food scarcity? I mean, all of that started to come into play. And, that was one of the things that I was so fascinated in. And one of the reasons why I approached Lauren about that when we were suddenly in the midst of a pandemic. As Nathan said, there are lots of little pandemics that happen regularly, and they burn themselves out. And this was the first one in 50 years, 100 years that went global. So that was, the connection back to his work was there. And then Lauren did the amazing thing, which was to not write about the immediate moment, but to connect the immediate moment through a very human connector. And that's where Bill comes in. And Bill had to figure out how to bring that to life.
Yeah. Oh boy. I don't want to overlap. So just to be quick, this show was designed and created with the intention of being given life during this insane time. And there's, as crazy as it all was, there's really no other way for it to have happened. And ultimately the product we got was this beautiful kind of bastard child that's like the perfect blending, in my opinion, of theater and film. And I think it's among the best of the pandemic theatrical film things that have happened during this year and a half. I've only done a one-man show one other time, and I wrote that. So it's kind of a cheat. But even in that process, there are collaborators who were in the room with you. And one of the things that I think actors at one time take for granted, and is also the thing that they enjoy the most, is that immediate family that's created when you're in your hometown, or as is often the case, not in your hometown, and you're surrounded with all these creative people who all have the same goal in mind and often have really brilliant different ways of getting there. And it was a very lonely process. I mean, Jason was as present as he could be without being allowed to be in a room with me until we started filming. And Lauren, who has become a dear friend, who's so supportive, but I only saw her once when Nathan and her and her kids and I went on a hike. She was always on a little Zoom screen. The same for our dramaturg, Martine, who's also a great friend. So I was in my little company housing, graciously donated by some wonderful Marin sponsors, just in this little room by myself for pretty much the whole process. We were supposed to have 2 weeks in the theater, but because the COVID regulations changed, we only had 1 week. And because Marin is being very proactive and responsible in terms of being more equitable in their employment practices, we're doing the 5-day theater week and not the 6-day theater week. So we had 5 days to rehearse, tech, and stage and block the whole thing. So yeah, so that was not a lot of time. Yeah, so that's that. And this is totally random. It's just freaking out because there's a cat up here named William Barnett, and Barnett is my middle name. So so what's up, Will? Nice to see you.
Oh, wow. Okay. All of the connections and the name connections coming through as well. And when I heard you mention Martine, that made me think of my partner, who's somewhere on this call. It's also named Martine. So alas, here we are. Wow. I mean, to be able to accomplish so much in so little time, but also to hear kind of the way in which everyone was kind of on an island in so many different ways, like really, I mean, it really relates to that sense of alienation, loneliness that so many have felt during the pandemic, and yet to have such an intimate view into at least the character of Nathan and Nathan's life is really interesting. And upon, many viewings of it, it's like, I almost feel, Nathan, like I know you in a very weird, intimate, and strange way. So Nathan,
I mean, Kendall, there's just one thing I'm really glad you said the character of Nathan, because this is a conversation that Jason and Lauren and I had to have, which is, and I always use this reference, so forgive me for being redundant and derivative, but like, am I Daniel Day-Lewising it? Are you calling me Mr. Nathan on set, or am I playing a character that is Nathan, but is a fictional representation? And although it's freaky, Nathan and I have a lot of overlap in our lives, and our baby pictures look the same. Wow. I'm glad my hair is long, or you wouldn't tell us apart. It's still very much a character of a real person, but it's not like a character study.
Interesting. And this is like, it's fascinating. And from talking to you and hearing that there was so much overlap, that also blew my mind. But Nathan, there's this line that I love from the play, like, it's a risk being married to a playwright. So Nathan, you spend so much of your time in the worlds of virology, and I guess also like tech, entrepreneurship, as opposed to theater workshops and productions. What was it like for you to have your life, your work be the subject of this play? And I mean, especially being that this is JTS, like, I have to ask, like, for your Jewish identity to be such a central part of the drama.
Yes, and of course, in some ways, it's mostly when you take a step back, it's such a huge honor and a privilege to have a story that even if it's just a character, represents your life and your work and your family and the complexity of your identity as a scientist, as a Jewish person in the world. I'm proud of the work that I've done with my colleagues, but most people who do science like myself don't get a play written about them. The other people on Lauren's list are Newton, and so it's a great honor, and it also, to a certain extent, creates a bookending of a period of my life that was represented in some ways. And it really is a character, right? There's two sides of it. The quote about, I shouldn't say quote, but the line about there's a risk being married to a playwright is, Lauren is so prolific, right? She's the most prolific playwright in America, most produced playwright in America. there's all these characters, they're drawn from life, they're meant to evoke features of universality of human character. And it's very dangerous to potentially read yourself into these different characters, right? Because they're often unappealing or have unappealing things happen to them. And so I would say very early in our relationship, I learned a couple of things. Number one, Lauren always asks me, but I try not to weigh in, even if I have an opinion, because her process is, they're very technical, and of course I answer questions, but I try not to weigh in, and also don't read too much into characters. Now, it was a bit harder not to read into this particular character, but it was for those of you who have seen it, or those of you who haven't, it's a very loving portrayal. It's a very gentle and thoughtful portrayal. And it doesn't, I think it does a good job of, Bill has mentioned this in some of the talkbacks we've done. Among the things that I thought was so fascinating, sorry, Bill, I'll steal what's really your point, is as a Jewish American who has an interesting relationship to Judaism. I come from a family that was, my father and both sides of my family have a very strong Jewish identity, and I do as well, but I'm an atheist. And trying to come to grips with, do I really feel that, all the world to save a person? No, not really. I'm more of a public health guy, frankly, right? And again, I know that there's the capacity to interpret within Judaism in a more subtle and nuanced and broader way some of these features, but, I very much sided with a population level view. But it is interesting that Jewish representation in the arts, and this is not my area of expertise, but you never quite get what Lauren produced, which is very much not a play about Judaism, but it's also not Judaism being hidden. Judaism is just like an obvious feature of this character in a way that I don't remember seeing much theatrical or really any medium presenting Judaism in that way. So, part of this is the features of the character that you look in the mirror and see, but a lot of it is also the relationship to my dad, the relationship to my kids, my relationship with my religion, how I see Judaism portrayed, all of which I think were in some ways the most meaningful part of the art, more so than the content or that it was done during a pandemic or any of those things.
It's so fascinating to see this piece unfold, knowing that it is based on a person. And I mean, thankfully, because of the bit of training that I've done, I know that there is this, this has to be crafted in order to be a play. And Lauren, in terms of reading some of the other interviews that you did, and I love the fact that you like and you embrace big emotions in your work, but also like well-written big emotions that often tackle really difficult topics like science. But I completely agree. There's this sense of almost like Judaism is in the water, but it's not, but it also feels like a very universal piece, which maybe with the exception of a couple of plays, I'm thinking like Bad Jews by Joshua Harmon kind of does some funny stuff with Jewish identity where it's kind of incidental, but no, it feels it's unique in that way. And for it to be written during the pandemic also feels very unique. Going into this part about the craft around this and the fact that this is a character, Lauren, there's that phrase, that leitmotif that just appears all throughout the play. My wife would like you to know. And this line for me, it's pretty trippy because it like draws attention to you, the writer, or at least some fictionalized version of you, even though you are never on stage. So I would be really curious to know how you and Jason approach this idea of the absent writer as a character who just appears all throughout the play.
That's a really cool thing. I'd love to know Jason's answer, but for me, it was one of those things as a writer, I'm always looking for not just, can I write this play, but can I do something that hasn't been done yet with this play? And so when Jason brought this up, it's like, yeah, no, I totally write a play, but is it worth writing? Is it new? Is it fresh? Is there something sideways about it, surprising about it? And that line, as I mentioned earlier, was the thing that made me go, what does that mean? What dominoes does that start tipping over? Structurally, emotionally, psychologically, metaphysically. And so this idea of a playwright, of an unseen, unheard playwright, kind of speaking through her character, kind of using stage direction and transition, it's so beautifully filmed by our cinematographer, Peter Rocco. And the way a scene moves into another scene, and sometimes he yanks the character, sometimes pushes, sometimes begs to move forward, and sometimes says, no, you're not going that way, you're going this way. That just felt so, to borrow your word, which is a perfect word, it is trippy. It's like, I'd never seen that. I'd never, and so I wanted to follow that instinct as a way to tell this story that is complex. And in some ways, a lot of my plays, but certainly this one, kind of work the way dreams or memories do, which isn't linear. It jumps all around, and sometime you're here, but then a smell makes you remember this, but then that song makes you be here, but then it makes you think of that thing you wish you'd said to that person who's gone now, but now you're back where you are. And how all of those things are happening in some ways at once. And how can we use that as the roller coaster of emotion and plot that makes us lean forward and kind of, I wonder what they're going to do, or I wonder what they're hiding. And, all of those things to me feel like good fodder for a juicy character. But frankly, it's also a lot to ask an actor. Like, it's a lot to ask a director. It's a lot to ask everyone to do this kind of thing, knowing what the meat of this play is really about. It's about resilience, but resilience means loss. Resilience means coming up against struggle. Resilience means you can't be resilient without pain and trial. And that's part of, in terms of the intimacy between Nathan and I, as I was thinking about writing this, there's a lot of ways to tell parts of Nathan's story or parts of his science. But really what I had to say was, like, you've seen my plays, that the character going through them is generally not having a great time all of the time. They are met with crisis of their lives, of utter definitional trauma and strangeness and worry and, breach and betrayal. And there's a lot going on in it. It's a lot to ask somebody to go, so I'm going to tell your story, which means all of the hard stuff is going to be what I play in. And that's a lot to ask somebody. And it takes a lot of trust, and it takes a lot of conversation to figure out how to do that without simplifying things, because life is complex and our decisions are complex and our baggage is complex. How to do that while respecting and honoring Nathan and his family and the parts of it that were very much based on life, and then the parts to go, like, I know this didn't actually happen, but I'm gonna judge it theatrically in this way and that. So there's a lot of there. And it requires incredibly good direction, which Jason provided, and incredible and brave acting and interpretation, which Bill provided. It asks a lot, and because it's so intimate, those of you who've seen it, some of the ways we try to break this and bridge what works for theater and works for film, just an example being, you're not supposed to look at the camera in film. And that's the first thing our character does. And you're not supposed to be able to kind of theatricalize on film the way that Bill's able to do, and then bounce right into a kind of film acting that's so quiet and intimate and specific. And then back to a theater yelling on the top of your lungs on a theatrical stage. Like, it bounces all around. So I think we all kind of were like, we all don't know what we're doing. And yet we really do, because it's about truth and it's about intimacy and it's about authenticity. And as long as we're going that, as long as that's our North Star, whatever it looks like, whatever choices we come up against, we'll brave those. But that kind of has to be the center point.
Lovely. Jason and Bill, what was that process like for you, especially to some extent, the absent writer inside of the piece, but I imagine that there are any number of other themes that also came up relating to that, or even in just what Lauren shared.
Yeah, and for Bill and I, the thing that we needed to do was we needed to figure out how to make the stakes as high as possible. in terms of what Nathan was going through. And what we were able to do was to actually, and here come spoilers, so if you haven't seen it yet, you can mute now. But we went to the end and we said, okay, so he's on a table and he's alone and he's being cut open right now. And why is he in a theater? And one of the things that raised the stakes the highest for Bill was to say he's in a theater because that's the safest place he can envision being, is in his wife's hands, not in someone else's hands, not under this surgeon's hands, but in his wife's hands. So in a weird way, we took something that allowed Lauren permission to go to places in Nathan's real life to fictionalize them by having that refrain. We kind of flipped it on its head and said Nathan was making this up in order to reveal things that he needed to reveal to himself to get through this journey. So for Bill and I, and Bill, I want you to jump in here in a second, but it was Nathan's way of getting past things that Nathan would never talk about for whatever reason. And Nathan was able to blame Lauren and then go into the places that he needed to go to get where he needed to go through the story, to get from his fear of being under the knife to being able to move on.
I'm going to stop trying to make this a linear thought process because it's not going to be. Lauren, one of the things that I love about her as a writer, and one of the things that I think makes her special, is she's able to write things that need to be comprehended intellectually, and then she writes in the same play, in the same scene, in the same line, things that need to be apprehended, things that you have to hold, but you can't necessarily explain, right? And Jason helped me bridge that, because I sort of understood the play, right? but I couldn't quite figure out how it operated, and in order to use a word that doesn't really apply to art necessarily, but in order to be successful, I needed to understand the signposts along the roadmap a little better. And in specifying where the character of Nathan physically was, as Jason was saying, on this, in this hospital setting, and that this was in his mind, and that he was safest in his wife's hands, and that Lauren was actually going to be a character in the theater, it gave me emotional stakes, to use like the MFA buzzwords, but it also gave me people to relate to, or person to relate to. And as Jason and Lauren was saying, you're in a Marvel movie, you look at the camera, you're fired, but because that's so much special effects wasted. But here, once I accepted that, oh, no, I can do this, I can look right here, then that was a safe place for me. And also, it's kind of a cheat, but having been recently married, having gone through painful surgeries, having lost people very close to me, having been, as we all were, kind of trapped for, I guess, at that point, close to a year-ish. Well, not a year, but, whatever months it was. There was just a lot of emotional rawness that I didn't even have to think to tap into. Because look, all of our mental health collectively suffered. So, and this was my first time on stage in, I think, about a year at that point. It was my first time acting in front of the camera in many, many months. So they always tell you to use it. And there was just a lot to use. And the whole team, Peter, Lauren, Nathan, Jason, our COVID compliance officer, everyone made me feel really safe and taken care of, in spite of the neuroses that I was displaying. So yeah, there you go.
Wonderful. And this is, I see that some questions are starting to come in. So I just want to remind everyone that it's wonderful for you to bring your questions, pose your questions. The hope is that we will get to several of them, and we'll certainly have time to be able to do that. One question that's really been swimming around in my mind, because as I really love the fact that you said that you need to comprehend and apprehend in this play, Bill, because I think in my first reading, I was getting like okay, I'm comprehending what's going on and I'm feeling something and I'm trying to find the intersection of those two. And then upon my third viewing, like one of the things that I was realizing is there's such an ironic line. And the reason I'm going on a bit long about this is it relates to a question that someone asked, is there's this irony of the character of Nathan saying, like, humans, not that important. Just knock it all down. It's simply not important. And yet, as we go more and more in the piece, the character of Nathan is focusing less and less on the work and much more on the story, much more on the relationship, much more on father to son, son to father. I mean, there are so many delicious lines that come out and just kind of rip your heart open. And as I watched it that time, I was like, ooh, I'm apprehending this in a new way. And from this comes a question from David Kramer, Professor Kramer. I'm such a Southern boy. I want to be like Dr. or Professor Kramer. So he said, I found the play incredibly profound, philosophical, sensitive, and much more, and he recommended it to everyone that he cares about. What does it mean that humans are so fleeting, so insignificant, but so important to one another? And I think that really gets at this irony that is being handled really beautifully throughout the piece. And Lauren, Nathan, I don't know if either of you want to start with some meditations on that.
A Nathan question to me.
Sure. It's interesting. So as a biologist and a virologist, you sort of begin by deconstructing our sense of the world, right? Most of the genetic material on the planet is microbial, bacterial, and viral. Most of the diversity of life is in the microbial realm. Such a limited percentage of it is humans. So many of the major findings in scientific history have been related to countering instinctual feelings of centeredness that we have as humans. We're the center of the universe, we're the center of the galaxy, we're the center of our solar system, we're the only ones that can do X, Y, and Z, we're the most important in these different ways. And I think that part of what I enjoyed and valued in my scientific education came about with the recognition that those things were not true, and that there was still something special and beautiful about being human, even if it was much more limited, that the world didn't revolve around us, but we were that point in the universe that was conscious of itself, that was aware, that could imagine itself. You know, and of course, I do think we also have to ask this tough question of ourselves when we look around the universe and look around our world. I was looking at a paper with my 6-year-old Charles, we were asking the question of, you know, what's the distribution of life on Earth? And there was a great paper that happened to be written by one of my colleagues down at Caltech named Rob Phillips, who really tried to estimate the mass of life on the planet. And among the findings was that there's probably more chicken biomass than there is of all wild birds combined. And so I do think that there's two features of it. One is like knocking away at the sort of ego of humanity and recognizing that we will only understand the world when we're willing to give up our centrality to it. But the flip side also being the reality that the way that we function on this planet is having profound impacts on it. And you could think about this socially, or biologically, or in terms of climate, that are often negative, to say the least. And so how do we put that all together? How do we reconcile that with our desire to see the better parts of ourselves, the beautiful parts of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that can heal and understand? And I don't think it's an easy question. And I think that I often wonder, right, part of me as a scientist is more interested in nature than actually doing something to save humanity. And I do think that, frankly, is part of the legacy of myself as a Jew, is the desire to, or the feeling of a need to do something about humanity. But I think we should be open and honest about the positive, but also negative features of who we are and what our impact is on our world. Sorry, that was a little dark,
but
dark.
You know, what I hear from that dramatist, this is why the play happened, is because out of that darkness, or out of that kind of irony, I don't know why that word popped into my head, but that kind of the inhumanity of those ideas, meaning literally not focusing away from the humanity, comes the moment when your son is born, comes the moment when you fall in love, comes the moment when you lose a parent. And suddenly it is all humanity, all emotion, inescapably seeking out for meaning, whether that's from science or religion or friends or music or art or whatever. And so that's what I love about theater, is we can have plays that are big brained and full of this interesting existential ideas, but then it still is grounded in our chemical humanity, which we love what we love and we feel what we feel. And sometimes it's really hard and it's really sad, and sometimes it's really glorious. And so this is again when I thought, like, oh, maybe we can write about this guy, because there's a lot, there's a lot of head and there's a lot of heart.
Absolutely. And I have to admit, I was so thrilled to have a theater experience where the specificity of the science was so apparent. Like, even though, okay, I did my 2 science credits at Oberlin in order to graduate, if I'm being honest, only 2, or 2 classes, but I loved the fact that there were so many moments where it wasn't dumbed down, but rather it was theatricalized. And I mean, I think that's a rare skill, Lauren, to be able to translate that, but also realizing a translation does not necessarily mean like, I need to spoon feed you in this way, but to trust that the emotion, that the humanity will be a thing that allows it to connect. So thank you all for that, and thank you for that reflection. Some other lovely questions are coming in here. Noticing some very particular details. I'm sure that you all see them scrolling too. To go to one of them here, this is from Jane to William, Bill. Loved how you inhabited the character of Nathan in the small question. Jane noticed that you wore a watch on your right hand. Was it to indicate that the character of Nathan is left-handed?
So, that's one of those, if I was like a more interesting actor, I would have some super evasive answer and be like, I don't want to pollute your version of the character that I've created. And if you're left-handed, I want you to be able to identify with. I just really like wearing my watch in my right hand. It was a comfort thing. Gotcha. And I know when I do that in life, everyone's like, oh, you're left-handed. Like, no, I use my right hand a lot, so it just makes sense. And every artist, every athlete, anyone that invests a lot of themselves in anything, they need their little totems, right? So that's one of my things.
Thanks for bringing us into the actor's process. One other question to stick with you, Bill, before we weave in a couple of other questions from folks here. So, as I said, this is presented with the Kendall, I keep saying Kendall because that's how I'm pronouncing my name, Kendall. So Kendall Center for Justice and Ethics. So we're concerned about justice and ethics. And so there are these bigger themes that we're talking about around justice as well. We've already touched on environmental justice. We've touched on, Jason, and you're speaking about the choices that are made in the first world affecting developing world based on Nathan's book. Bill, one thing you and I talked about somewhat extensively is how this play was one of the very, very few moments that you had to be a professional Jew on stage in a way, and as a Jew of color. So I know that I wrote a little bit about this in an interview we did, but I'd love it if you could just share a touch about this experience and what it has meant for you, and kind of some of the complexity surrounding that.
Sure. I want to, in that answer, touch on something that Nathan said about how this play deals with Judaism in a non-mainstream way. I think we're allowed to see a lot of various denominations of Christian characters who are always touching on their Christian identity in media, whether it's they wear a cross or they're saying grace or something that's like very quotidian. And that play, that movie, that TV show is not about Christianity, but with the vast majority of media, plays, music, whatever, that is about Judaism, it's always about, the Holocaust or the Exodus or a handful of things. And it's so rare to see a Jewish character just inhabiting the world with a Jewish identity without it being about Judaism, while still acknowledging that they're Jewish. Like everyone on Seinfeld, it was Jewish, but they never talked about it, right? So I didn't learn until later that it was important to Lauren that the actor playing the character of Nathan be a Jewish actor, and that meant a lot to me that she prioritized that. And it meant a lot to me that Lauren and Nathan chose me, and me as a bluish person and Jew of color actor to play this part, because as your question said, is this the first time? I think this is the first time. No, second time I've been professionally Jewish. First time I've been Black and Jewish in anything. And also that was never addressed, right? It's just, this is the actor playing this character. There you go. Which I really like, because sort of being in your face in a way is one of the ways that I try to move the needle, right? By either forcing conversations with my words or forcing conversations by just being in the space and claiming who I am. Kendall, until I met you, I didn't really know there was a larger Jew of color community, because it's just been like me and like random pockets of people. So yeah, it was great to be able, by no means do I think actors should only play like what they are, but it's lovely when you are able to use your own personal experiences in like a deep way, that you have a comprehension and an apprehension of these things. And to do it in a play that it deals with religion in such a complex way, and how religion and science are not mutually exclusive, and how they can inform one another, and how they're in dialogue. And I think bridging a lot of things which we think of as disparate things. I hope that answered your question.
That lovely answer. And I always love how every conversation we have, we go all around the world, because that's, art encompasses the whole world, just like, as the rabbi said, Torah encompasses the whole world as well. There's a question that someone asked that I'm actually going to ask the question in its more direct way, but also kind of, I think, connected to some broader themes here. So there's this thing that happens towards the end of the play where Nathan, the character of Nathan, is misrepresented by a journalist. And that's kind of like a very personal kind of like attack, and or is perceived as a kind of like injustice, particularly for blaming the team for botching the spread of Ebola. So Steve is wondering if all of you could talk about, from your different perspectives, about that incident, and both how it hit you, how you metabolized it, like maybe even in there is a question of like, to what extent does this map onto reality. But the kind of like bigger question that I think can also be asked from that is like, what is it about theater that is especially good at addressing both the small injustices, but also these bigger matters of justice in society? So we can start at the personal, but I think we can also take it to a bit more of the like global as well. So Nathan, I don't know if you want to start with some of the specifics of that.
Sure. Look, it's very interesting when you spend the way the world focuses on catastrophes is very much kind of a staggered thing. Either like right now, how many in this audience have really thought much about terrorism over the last 6 to 12 months? Not a ton. How much time is it on the front page? The same is true for pandemics, right? Either it's something everybody's paying attention to or they're not. But there's a community of individuals for almost all of these catastrophic risks that is their day-to-day life is focused on it. You know, the Ebola crisis is so fascinating, and I spent quite a bit of time talking about it currently in a way that's counterintuitive, because one of my big messages is don't fight the last war, right? We're going to invest a tremendous amount of energy in post-COVID prevention of future pandemics. Are we going to be preventing COVID? Because the next one's going to be something different. And our response to Ebola, our response to influenza outbreaks is always to protect ourselves from the last one we had. You know, it was very difficult for me and my teams, most of whom are African, right, that work in Africa. So most of my colleagues that I work with are Cameroonian or from Sierra Leone or from Congo, and they spend their day-to-day life trying to think about what are the risks that we have? How do we create systems that are resilient despite all of the tremendous challenges, right? And then, you know, to have those teams, and it wasn't really me. I had spent no time in Sierra Leone. It was not a country I had expertise in, right? So it wasn't really me personally at all. But to say, hey, here are these scientists that said, we think there's real risk in this community. Our job is not to respond, but it's to go there to understand these things. They put themselves in the middle of a place where the risk is. They're right in identifying it. The government then comes to them and says, okay, this is happening. Everybody, the world's ignoring us. Can you help us? And the response is like, well, we don't really do response. We do prevention. They all bend over backwards to do their best to respond. So it was very personal for me. It was very, you know, it was a very complicated thing, and nobody did it right. So it's not like there's an answer which is, no, this was perfect and it was all wrong. That's just not the way these things occur. And of course, the bigger crisis transcends, you know, it's like Guinea and Sierra Leone are so poor that the other countries that I work in, like Cameroon, for example, I always say like Guinea and Sierra Leone are, you know, their poverty and challenge relative to Cameroon is like Cameroon relative to the United States, right? So it's also very easy to characterize all these, you know, a range of nations which we're not very familiar with. Like I ask yourself if you really know where Guinea is, you know? It's not a homogeneous group of states, and the fundamental neglect is not like how we dealt with the pandemic. That's, you know, the Ebola epidemic, that's one feature of it. It's that we permit in this world of tremendous abundance there to be such poverty that these kinds of things, you know, can happen, and that it needs to be an issue of, you know, why did we fail? Well, why not succeed before we have to fail? That's my view on it.
Thank you for that. And I think like that nice little last piece of connecting it also to the like this, the real scourge of poverty, which is something that, I mean, we talk about it, but probably don't talk about it enough. And so I mean, thank you for sharing kind of some of the inside of that. And Lauren, I'm curious, and I mean, you know, in being the playwright and in also being the person who is there, like what is it like to, you know, traverse that experience, then to write about it, but then also I know, I think it was from one of your interviews that you were actually called an artist activist. So like you often have your eye on like how to do justice while also representing the full complexity of what it is you're writing about. So I'd love to hear
Sure.
your
I mean, just to
perspective.
respond to what Nathan said, that is part of that is why the story is so good. Unfortunately, what makes it so good is because it was so hard. It was such a, and it was hard as his wife watching that happen and going, why are they saying these things? Why is this happening? This is unfair. This isn't right. And to see, you know, as he mentioned, his African colleagues, some of whom are the only women in their profession doing this incredible work, being thrown under the bus and saying, you know, all of this stuff. It was so frustrating for me. And of course, I can't barely begin to imagine what it was like for him and his colleagues. But that had to be in the play. And that was one of those exact things I was mentioning earlier. Like that is the trauma. That's the strife. You know, the professional strife of that moment, and the anger and of it is the piece of the play I was least looking forward to writing. That was the hardest. That was the most particular. And that's one where we went back and forth several times about how to exactly describe what you were going through. And I kind of did a pass at it. And he was like, yes, but also no. It was more like this, and it was more like this. And so finding that way to say that stuff was a real interesting lesson as a playwright, because I had to do it wrong before we could get to write. And that is a very interesting, I mean, Bill's acting in that moment and Jason's directing is really critical, because that's the explosion. That's the, I can't do this sitting down and being calm anymore. Like I have to get teethy and meaty and angry. And, you know, every play has that moment, usually about halfway through the second act, where all is lost. Everything's a mess. We can't save this. And out of that comes some revelation, comes some will to go on, comes some perseverance, comes some crisis that is born only from the recognition of going through that. And so too our play. But the activism of it is kind of separate from that. So set that aside for a moment. I mean, it's been really my life's work to do all forms of activism through art. Some of it is the content. Some of it is, this is a play about science, and science is important. And the fact that that's an activist statement these days is a little heartbreaking, but also I will run with it. Some of it is who you put on stage. Most of my work, except for this one, honestly, puts women center stage, and usually not just one, but several. And that is still a radical act in the theater, to have more than one woman on stage with agency in their own story. And so I've done that my whole life. And some of it is, you know, resuscitating female scientists or politicians or idea makers from history that we've forgotten, and giving them their story finally, so that we have new science heroes or new feminist heroes. And, you know, I have a musical that was just announced today, coming to the Signature, about voting, and the idea of the as you know, Biden mentioned a few days ago, the kind of primacy of the fight for a free and fair vote for all in America. And, you know, so that is a very much more activist political play. And sometimes it's just women on stage choosing their own lives and saying, listen to me, I'm a human too. It's also an odd thing to think of as activism, but it is. And in this case, I think I didn't realize until the opening night and talking to Nathan, frankly, about the Judaism. I'm not Jewish. And one of the gifts of my life is being in Nathan's family and coming to know Jewish culture and tradition, and some of these things I find invaluable now. I don't know how to mourn without Jewish mourning now. I think it is the greatest gift to humanity, is how to process grief in a specifically Jewish way. And I didn't grow up with any of that. And I feel like many of the griefs of my life would have been better served having gone through that specific process. So there's a kind of way of putting that center stage, which to me, it is obvious now. It wasn't until I joined Nathan's family and they embraced me, and I'm deeply grateful for that. So that is whatever version of activism that is, it's just true. And if it's unknown, then this makes it a little more known and a little more appreciative and a little more normalized, certainly in our odd country, which anti-Semitism is, of course, on the rise in a very virulent way. To make this, and of course, to make this an absolutely, to make this a how could you not, is some version of, as Bill says, kind of pushing the needle.
I'm enjoying this so much because I think we've probably brought together like 5 or 6 different themes, all of which we could speak on for an extended period of time. And Lauren, I love what you were saying and how it actually brings together some of what a question that came up from Lauren about the intersection of Judaism and theatricality. Like, where is it that you find the overlaps in the practice of theater and the practice of Judaism? And I would even expand that to like the practice of religiosity, like if, you know, so, and or culture. And so how did working on this play for all of you inform or influence some aspect of either how you relate to Judaism, how you relate to culture, how you relate to religion? And I'd be really curious to get Jason and Bill in here.
Bill, you go ahead and go.
All right. So I'm a grown-up, but I'm an orphan. My mom died 10-ish more years ago, and my dad died when I was a kid, and I'm an only child. And I'm someone that, like, the spiritual part of my life is something I don't really talk about a lot, and even talk about with myself very much. But because of everything that happened last year, and really working on this show and having to address parental loss regularly and potential loss regularly and birth and all the huge life-changing moments that the play brings up, and also just being grateful that in a time where so many people who are close friends, some who aren't, some who I consider to be contemporaries, some who I think are like way better at what I do than I am, weren't working. I was very grateful to be trusted with such a meaningful project by people I respect so much, and to portray someone who I respect so much. So there was a lot of gratitude to be practiced and a lot of time to be alone to do it. So yeah, I'm a lot more in touch with my spirituality than I was. My relationship to Judaism is probably still more cultural than it is practical. You know, I don't speak Hebrew or read it. I wish I did. I'm having enough trouble learning Spanish. You know, and it's been hard for me to go back to temple since my mom died, but it's on my list. You know, once the world comes back, it'll be a little easier. But yeah, it's definitely, like I say, I should heck on you like every night before I go to sleep. My wife doesn't even know that. Well, I don't think anyone knows that, but you all know it now, all 78 of you on here. So there you go.
Yeah, well, you know, for me, the thing about theater is theater's always done what religion did for me when I was younger. Religion for me was always about, I was almost a Southern Baptist minister, to be really honest. It was about learning about things that I didn't know about and things that I was missing that I then could do better the next time. And story through religion was always about learning things that I didn't know and how to be a better person in the world and how to make a better contribution. And
I think you muted accidentally.
sorry.
There we go.
Yeah, helping people that's why I wanted to be a minister, was to tell stories on a regular basis and to give people ideas of things that maybe they didn't understand and how they could practice things better. And theater did that without the institution, because when I was old enough to understand the institution, I quickly fell out of love with wanting to be a part of it. Also, 6 sermons a year seemed a lot better than 52. And so, you know, for me, that's what this has always been. And you know, the work that I do has always kind of walked a very fine line between, it's always been very morally complicated. You know, I did a musical in Atlanta that was centered around a guy who had a history and a potentiality of pedophilia. And, you know, you think about that subject in a musical being tied in the same sentence, much less in any other way. And you're like, wait, what? But helping people see new ways of looking at the world is what this has always been for me. And, you know, again, it kind of goes back to where his work was intersecting. And I think I'm really excited to see where Nathan goes with his work in the future, because I think he's always walking a line between science and a bigger social narrative around that science. And I think that's something that good theater and good religious thinkers push us to do, is to make a better society out of these stories and out of ways of learning. So.
Oh, that's so lovely.
Comes to me is, so my dad's a preacher, also Southern Baptist, but we were the liberal kind. We were in DeKalb County that turned Georgia blue. So something to think about. But what occurred to me is, what always made me cry at the end of every church service I went to was the benediction. And in my church, the pastor, who I'd known since I was a kid, wearing his rainbow colored stole and, you know, would walk down the center aisle of the church and basically say, go out into the world. And that sentiment is what I connect theater with in terms of this activism, in terms of social justice. Yes, we want to change hearts and minds and engage hearts and minds when you're in the theater, but I want to see what that change happens when you walk out. When the lights come up, who do you talk to? Who do you hug harder? Who do you call and say, I just want to say that I love you and I miss you? How do you vote differently? How do you donate differently? How do you think about that person I may have judged earlier? And it makes me, having seen that play now, I perhaps have more empathy and understanding for them, and that changes my actions. So that's when I think about, what is the benediction of the Catastrophist? What is the benediction of the plays that you see, the musicals you see, the movies you see, that changes you as you're walking out going, I feel different. I feel engaged. I feel inspired. I feel enlightened. That's the stuff that makes theater matter to me.
Wow. I mean, honestly, I think we have no better benediction than that and what all of you shared. And so with that, we're going to slowly move ourselves beyond this sacred time. I very much view theater as sacred, as I think all of us on this that are in the spotlight on the screen do. Thank you all so much for being here with us this evening. Thank you to Lauren Gunderson. Thank you to Nathan Wolf. Thank you to Bill Demerit, William Demerit. Thank you to Jason Menadakis. Also, thank you to our co-presenters, so to Marin Theater Company and to Roundhouse Theater for their generous partnership. I also want to thank, we actually had a lot of wonderful co-sponsors who sent out the word, and I want to thank them individually. So thank you to Amud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy. Thank you to Bechol Lashon. Thank you to the Edlovich DC JCC. Thank you to Marlene Meyerson, JCC Manhattan. Thank you to the Miles Nadal JCC in downtown Toronto. Thank you to the New Jewish Culture Fellowship. Thank you to No Silence on Race, which is based in Toronto. JCC East Bay, thank you. Thank you to Reboot. Thank you to the 14th Street Y. Also, a hearty thank you so much to Ruth and to Steve Hendel. Thank you to Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay for your support in helping us bring this together. And as a last thing, as Rabbi Reske mentioned at the top of this evening, we have a new something coming to JTS. There is this arts fellowship that tentatively the title is called The Workshop. We might find a better title for it, that will feature and foreground the works of 6 Jew of color artists and also artists from Sephardic and Mizrahi backgrounds. We will be launching this fall based at JTS with some other partners who will contribute in-kind support. It will be a year-long New York-based fellowship, the first of its kind to stir up, interrogate, incubate, and expand ideas of Jewish art and ritual by centering these wonderful artists. So make sure to be on the lookout for announcements later this year, including invitations to attend artist salons, exhibits, presentations, and performances. And with that being said, may everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you sooner rather than later. Be well, everyone.
Thank you all so much.